So just so everyone knows, we are recording this. Welcome all. My name is Luke Whitington. I'm the Executive Officer of the Search Foundation and I'm your host for this event. Before we begin, please be aware that this briefing is being recorded so we can post it later to the Search Foundation YouTube channel. I'll post a link to that in the chat section. Indeed, I'll post links to lots of things in the chat section during the meeting, so don't worry if you miss a reference. For instance, where you can buy the two books that we'll be discussing tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging, as we always do, that we are meeting here in Australia on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. Sovereignty of this land was never ceded. This land was taken without consent, without treaty, and without compensation. I pay my respects to elders and leaders past, present, and emerging of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, traditional owners, and First Nations all across the continent. I'm on Gundungurra and Darug land, here in the Blue Mountains, where we say Warami Gamarada, welcome comrades. We're very lucky to have Anitra Nelson and Vincent Liegey with us tonight. I'm hoping I'll get your last name right there, Vincent. I think Vincent's correct in the first bit, but I'm not sure about the second. But before we get into that, first I'll tell everyone about the event and then give a 30-second intro to Search and then a 1-minute introduction to Anitra Nelson and Vincent Liegey and tell you a little bit about the first book that we'll discuss. Anitra will then speak for around 10 minutes and then Vincent will speak in conversation with Anitra. So a little bit different to our usual program of one speaker. After that, we'll have questions, which I invite you to submit in writing in the chat section to me directly. We'll wrap up on the hour when you can hang up or stay on the line for a few minutes to listen to a song, during which time you can post messages to everyone, including Anitra and Vincent, in the chat section. All participants will be muted unless called upon to ask a question. After you've asked your question, please mute yourself again. When you submit your question, please let me know if you're happy to ask your question yourself or if you would like me to ask it on your behalf. Please remember to do that. I always have to check with people. The chat section is limited to messages to me as host until the very end when we open up and you can message anyone you like. So a quick introduction to Search. Search is a membership-based democratic socialist organisation that enables and links socialist activists across political parties, generations and movements all around Australia. We have a diverse membership, but we have common values, summarised in our goal of democratic ecological socialism. We run socialist education programs, publish news and views on Facebook and through Search News at search.org.au, and we put on events like this one. This event is the latest in a series which has included Adam Bant, Bernard Collaery, Sharon Burrow, Michelle O'Neill, Rebecca Huntley, Paddy Manning, just to name a few. I encourage you to like the Search Facebook page to keep up with our events and go to search.org.au if you are interested in applying for membership. Our contact details are on the website and our Facebook page if you would like to talk to me about an event, our education program, or any other matter. Now to introduce Anitra Nelson and Vincent Liegey and the two books they'll be talking about tonight. I should mention that Vincent is the lead author of the book Degrowth that we'll be talking about primarily. And I should apologise for the absence of one of the authors, Marina Citrin, who had to pull out of the event. Some of our early promotions were saying that she would be able to come along, but she's got some issues over there in New York. It's very early in the morning and we can't have her on tonight, but maybe in the future we'll be able to have her. And we will be talking about her book, Pandemic Solidarity. So about Anitra Nelson and Vincent Liegey. Anitra Nelson is Honorary Principal Fellow at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute at the University of Melbourne. Associate Professor Anitra Nelson is the author of Small is Necessary, Shared Living on a Shared Planet, published in 2018, and co-editor of Life Without Money 2011, Housing for Degrowth 2018, and Food for Degrowth 2020. Vincent Liegey is an engineer, interdisciplinary researcher, spokesperson for both the French and international degrowth movements, and coordinates Cargonomia, a centre for research and experimentation on degrowth, a social cooperative for sustainable logistical solutions and local food distribution using cargo bikes in Budapest. The book Degrowth, I'll give a quick introduction to that before I switch to hand it over to Anitra Nelson. It's described, a sense of urgency pervades global environmentalism and the degrowth movement is bursting into the mainstream. As climate catastrophe looms closer, people are eager to learn what degrowth is about and whether we can save the planet by changing how we live. This book is an introduction to the movement. As politicians and corporations obsess over growth objectives, the degrowth movement demands that we must slow down the economy by transforming our economies, our politics and our cultures to live within Earth's limits. This book navigates the practice and strategies of the movement, looking at its strengths and weaknesses, covering horizontal democracy, local economies and the reduction of work. It shows us why degrowth is a compelling and realistic project. Sounds very exciting. It's really great to have you both here tonight. So I'll start with Dr. Anitra Nelson. Over to you.
Many thanks, Luke, to you and the Search Foundation for organising this event, especially in this busy time around the CPA centenary celebrations. I'm particularly happy to welcome my co-author Vincent Liegey from Budapest, and it's a great shame that we don't have Marina Citron here speaking from New York. Her son has actually got a cold, and this is at a point, and she's a single mother, and this is a point in history when, as you know, COVID-19 is really rampant. And so she decided that rather than get up at 5:30 in the morning, it would be better to be looking after him. But pandemic solidarity, yes, is still on our agenda, and it has considerable links to the degrowth movement and project presented in Exploring Degrowth. I'll just show you a copy of pandemic solidarity there. So the two books that we're talking about tonight are the first and second in a new series published by Pluto Press, a London publisher with an office in New York. I became involved with both books as a series editor for Fireworks, a series that highlights key eco-political concepts and practices, in these cases, the keyword mutual aid in pandemic solidarity and degrowth as a concept and movement in Exploring Degrowth. Now, most authors of books in the Fireworks series would refer to themselves as activist scholars, a term resonating with Gramsci's concept of the organic intellectual, in the sense that we express certain movements' collective consciousness at work and play. Vincent's and my book delves into, represents and comments on degrowth as a movement, how it operates and why it operates as an open, decentralised horizontal network. As such, both books represent movements of the 21st century that are vitally concerned with collective imaginaries for post-capitalist futures to address the great challenges our species faces right now. I expect everyone is more familiar with the term mutual aid than with degrowth. Indeed, I belong to Central Victorian Mutual Aid, which emerged earlier this year to promote already existing local production and distribution, especially in food and care work, as well as efforts to enhance direct political democracy. Such mutual aid efforts dovetail with degrowth, which focuses on sufficiency and meeting everyone's basic needs. The D in degrowth points to decreasing inequalities as much as decreasing use of energy, materials and wastes. Marina edited their collection with the authors organised as Collectiva Sembrar, specifically to produce their work. The idea for the book evolved in March from a network of activist scholars based throughout the world who are all experiencing disturbing and incredible developments as the pandemic hit their cities. By April, there were around 20 individuals and teams recording interviews with local activists and other participants in all kinds of mutual aid projects in the face of neglectful and sometimes terrifying state behaviour against disadvantaged groups, people with disabilities, persecuted minorities, the homeless, prisoners, Indigenous peoples, pregnant women, for whom pandemic restrictions posed life-threatening dangers. Collectiva Sembrar met at least weekly as a collective on Zoom. The interviews were analysed and transcribed in location, drafted and sent to Marina, who shared some with me and others with David Castle, the senior commissioning editor at Pluto Press. We all worked over these drafts, cutting and reshaping the material to highlight key moments and themes. By the end of May, we had a manuscript that was published in June. I'm outlining this as an example not only of activist journalism and collaborative work, but of horizontal practices in general. There was a good degree of mutual respect and mutual support throughout. The book starts with the bottom-up direct democracy well established by the autonomous administration of North and East Syria to show how local councils and communes in which decentralised decision-making enabled swift and efficient action in neighbourhoods with a central crisis committee comprised of representatives from regional committees attending to both health and education primarily. There are stories of people who fight for political prisoners and basic health needs in the face of ISIS insurgents and hostile acts of the Turkish and Syrian regimes. In a chapter on Turkish resistance to a dictatorship and needs for mutual support with food and legal advice, they too promptly created a new expansive rapid response network, identifying shortages and sharing necessities. All their efforts are summarised in the quote, "We got the message that everyone should take care of themselves. We continued to do what we know best, expanding our solidarity networks." There are chapters on experiences in Taiwan, South Korea and India, Mozambique, South Africa and Zimbabwe, Portugal, Italy. The chapter on Greece shows already existing mutual aid communities cranking up to protest, especially vulnerable political prisoners. There are stories from the United Kingdom, New Orleans and California, Argentina and Brazil. The common themes highlight states and health systems that failed people, effectively locking out minorities and accentuating inequalities. Curfews that prevented people gaining basic needs such as food. At the same time, the coronavirus was a unifying and non-discriminating threat. The intimacy and efficiency of grassroots mutual aid networks focusing on the COVID-19 crisis outlined in Pandemic Solidarity is testimony to forms of organising that already existed and point towards prefigurative experiments of various movements. Movements jointly concerned with ensuring that we appropriately respond to global warming and all other socio-political as well as ecological threats posed by late-stage capitalism. Of course, one of these movements is degrowth, to which we now turn. So Vincent, I'd like to ask you how you got into degrowth and how you practice degrowth in Budapest today. You able to unmute?
Hopefully you can in just 1 second.
There we are. All
yeah,
good.
Sorry for the technical problem. Yeah, my microphone was on mute. So thanks a lot, Anitra, for this introduction. Thanks a lot for the organizers to inviting us here. And yeah, we sent our greetings to our friend from New York who cannot join today, which is a pity because I had time to read through the Pandemic Solidarity, and I think it's a very inspiring book, which is very complementary to our book around exploring degrowth, and really reflect on what is my everyday life nowadays and what's happened in the last months with since the beginning of the pandemic in Hungary. And unfortunately, I'm afraid what will happen in the upcoming months with not only the pandemic second wave, but also the economic crisis or depression, what we are about to get with rising inequalities, with rising misery, exclusion, unemployment, and so on, where this type of solidarities will be more important than ever. So this book arrived at the right time to alert about how to reorganize our society. So to answer your question, Anitra, I arrived to degrowth, and I will make some type of storytelling, which is also reflecting from my intellectual journey to degrowth. Because I was first, when I was a teenager and a student, I was very active in a movement which somehow disappeared. The younger generation don't know so much about it anymore, unfortunately. It was the alter globalization movement. We were in the late 1990s, beginning of the 2000s. And I was a reader of Le Monde Diplomatique. I was a reader of Noam Chomsky and all this school of socialism, anarchist socialism, and so on, which were mostly focusing on social justice and fighting against imperialism. And when I speak about imperialism, I speak about this capitalist imperialism, where we could see the emergence of neoliberal ideology or dogma, presented as not an ideology, but as something which belongs to human beings. So we have to fight against this type of cultural imperialism, political imperialism, but also the imperialism of the Western world, in particular United States, and the industrial military complex behind United States, and it was after 9/11 and so on. And I was very active in this movement, and it was also the time in the beginning of the 2000s when we started to speak about environmental issues. And to be honest, as a typical leftist, a French leftist, I didn't understand much about these green issues, and I was even type of pissed off with my green friends. Why do we care about this insect or this bird when we speak about people dying in the imperialistic war in Middle East, when we speak about rising inequalities, when we speak about unemployment, when we speak about exploitation by the oligarchic system around the corporation and so on. And I had the opportunity to move to Hungary, where the alter globalist movement was quite different than in France, because it was focusing more on green issues rather than left issues, due to the particular history. The people in the same age than me in Hungary grew up in state capitalism, called at that time socialism. And for them, the left issues were a bit more difficult to address, where they were really doing wonderful work around green issues, and they started to speak to me about environmental justice. And that's also the time I started to hear about degrowth. And in particular, I started to study economics, and I discovered Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who was one of the pioneers of degrowth. He was somebody who had the same type of intellectual journey like me, because he started with mathematics and hard science like biology or physics. He was very fascinated by Sadi Carnot and the second law of thermodynamics, the entropy law. And he had the opportunity after to study economics. And when he studied, like me, when he started to study economics, he started to realize that it's a fake news what is taught every day in faculties of economics, that it's built on wrong assumptions. It doesn't take into account the basic laws of physics and so on. And as an engineer with this hard science background, I started to understand the connections between the challenges toward environmental justice and social justice. And that's how I joined degrowth, and I found it fascinating to find this very complex set of thoughts, which is really an umbrella thinking, connecting the dots with a lot of challenges that we face, and to bringing a very complex, radical, taking from the roots, understanding of where we are and where to go. And that's how I started my journey in degrowth. And we were already in the second part of the 2000s. And to be honest, when I discovered Georgescu-Roegen, I mostly used my rational engineer brain, and I started to study a lot, which made me quite depressed. Everything connected with peak oil, and we were in 2006, 2007, where we passed the peak of production of conventional oil, and it was also the time where, and there are direct interaction between both, when started the economic crisis. So, I mean, so-called the 2008 economic crisis and so on. And the more I was reading about this from a rational point of view, this problem what we faced toward peak oil, and I unpick everything, and I also went into a discussion and thinking about climate change, biodiversity loss, etc. I started to become quite depressed. At that time, we spoke about catastrophists, and I realized that it's not good for me, because I'm more and more and more depressed, and it's even worse for implementing meaningful discussion and implementing collectively self-organized solution toward this problem. I mean, if you bring something which is only about depressive news, it doesn't help. And that's how also I was fascinated, and I went into degrowth, because degrowth also bring the other parts about well-being, about very emancipatory, almost utopian approach, which totally fits with the challenge what we face from an environmental, energetical, physical point of view. And it's interesting because now we are like 15 years after, and I would say that I don't focus much anymore on these physical limits to growth, but more on the anthropological, cultural limits to growth. I mean that we live in a world which has an environmental footprint which is unsustainable. I speak about the richest people who I belong to and so on from the Western world. And we are far away from being as happy as a level of overconsumption and over-destruction of our environment, and even more as happy as a level of over-exploitation of other people. And I started to realize that we took a wrong way, and I started to explore not only from a theoretical point of view, but also in experiencing it myself. I started to explore other ways of life based on other principles, based on reappropriation of my time, of my know-hows, of my tools, of my interaction with other people, and questioning also a lot of things what I was taught to, like a patriarchat, and I'm a white male who was taught to be a mansplaining and so on. So it's still a long journey which is going on, and maybe I will never succeed on that. And it's what I also was very interested in degrowth, that it's not only very clear and bright on the environmental challenges and what we face, it brings a narrative about we are on the wrong way from a cultural point of view, which means that even if infinite growth on the fine planet will be possible, we should question whether it makes sense. And I think it's totally absurd. It doesn't make us happy to always work more, to produce more, to consume more, and so on. And it also brings together the practice and the theory, where the practice is always fed by the theory, but is also feeding the theory. And no, it's what I have the privilege to do in Budapest. So I have this big hood and a scarf, and I'm a bit cold, no, because I am in the small office in our farm next to Budapest. And I have the chance to experiment in my everyday life a lot of different type of things, and also to realize how I can find great emancipatory activities and great enjoyment of life and solidarities in finding a balance in my everyday life, where I work with my head, I work with my heart, I work with my hands, I work with a lot of other people, and we try to co-construct in being reflective, another world based on a lot of different type of values, like open relocalization, like ecofeminism, like conviviality, like autonomy. So how to reappropriate a type of enjoyment of life when you don't need to burn a lot of barrels of oil every day, when you don't need to buy a lot of useless things every day, but on the contrary, you can enjoy a lot of great time in sharing the knowledge, in sharing the hard task, in questioning yourself, in having more time for other type of things which somehow disappeared in our society, like poetry, like just to be lazy, like just to play some games and so on. And I would say that that's what degrowth is about, to put back utopia in a dystopic time, and without being utopian in the negative dimension. I mean, in being very realistic and bright in understanding what are the environmental, energetic, social, cultural, economic, political challenge what we face. And that's what we try to bring in the debate with degrowth, with different sphere of the debate, of the discussion, with political proposals, with political strategy for change, with very concrete practical solution, and all these things on different levels. And that's why we try to do. And thanks Anitra for the cooperation together with Anitra. And she said, or it was said that I am the lead author. I don't really like that. I think it was really on the same level cooperation, and we all brought our what we can bring in the picture. And our book is trying to offer these very global perspectives, what degrowth is offering, which is, I think, a very interesting matrix of thought and experimentation and practice, helping this particular time for meaningful discussion, meaningful debate, and also an invitation to decolonize our imaginaries, to open our mindsets, and to start to look out of the depressing world we are sticking on, and to start to realize that if you look from another dimension, the problem we face, you can turn them into opportunities. And we are in the turning point of our civilization, and the key question is, how are we able to put the right question on the table to implement the right solution, or not, which means that we will stay in the same logic, and we will create even more barbarities in this collapsing civilization.
That's great. Do you want to just talk a little bit about cargonomia?
Yeah, sure. So cargonomia is started with a friendship, a group of friends. We were living together in the same flat, and we were all quite different. Not everybody is on a diverse political or cultural agenda, which creates, and I think it's very fundamental, which creates type of fruitful dissensus and debate and discussion and so on. But we all brought different types of projects and ideas, and we started to think how to connect them together. So me, I brought more the degrowth theory and political agenda, and where some friends brought more like concrete projects, like organic farming, like cargo bike usage and cargo bike deliveries with the cargo bike center. Another one was more about how to reappropriate the tools and the know-hows, bringing low-tech approach, and how to construct your own solutions for energy, for the tools for the farm, or for transport and so on. And step by step, we started to implement type of cooperation, where we had a logistics center. I say we had because now it's we are moving out, so we are closing it, but we are launching new projects around it. We will totally redesign it. So we had a logistics center. Now we will hopefully have logistics centers in most of the city center districts of Budapest. So we even decentralize the network. We had an organic farm. From the organic farm, we also started to develop urban gardening, in particular with the great idea of urban agroforestry. So how to bring back agroforestry, biodiversity, and ecosystems within the city to totally rethink mineral city, which are, I think, killing us. And we have community supportive agriculture. And starting with that, we develop a lot of other type of projects. It's also a political think tank. It's a research center. It's a space where we welcome people to incubate other projects. It's a space where we welcome younger people, like a school of life, based a bit on Ivan Illich, a deschooling school. So it's not institutionalized type of trainings, but more participatory, self-organized. One of the co-founders of Cargonomia is very interested in solidarity economy, ecofeminism, and care work, and reciprocity economy. So we reflect a lot on all these concepts, and as much as possible, we try to construct projects and to drive projects without money, but based on how we can find solution with our network, learning ourselves, sharing the things, and so on. We experiment a lot the commons, like our cargo bikes. They don't really have ownership. They belong to the people who have a good usage of the cargo bike. And we also analyze how it changes the human interaction, and also how it changes our mindset and imaginary toward property. And for example, if it's not based on property and you pay to rent, you will respect the common, you will respect it, you will care about it as you care about your children, for example, or you care about your friends or your parents or whatsoever. So we experiment a lot of different type of things. And now we are a bit at the turning point of Cargonomia, because we have a lot of new opportunities. There was a new mayor elected last year in Budapest, and we try to implement cooperation with the municipality councils. And we would like to develop more cargo bike usage in all the city center, and to have cargo bike center to distribute organic, locally produced foods everywhere, and also to step by step go to a part of the city which will be totally car free, and also to bring even more urban gardening. So my dream would be to transform all the parking lots, large part of the streets which are now occupied by pieces of steel, what we call car, and to transform that into a kindergarten, into agroforestry, into nice fruit trees when you can get vegetable and so on, into convivial places when you can be creative, play the music, meet with each other, and so on. So it's a bit our dream, and I think Budapest is a fantastic playground for experimenting these things, because it's a city which have a long tradition for creativity.
Luke, have you got questions?
We do. We're getting lots and lots of questions.
Yeah.
So thank you everyone for those, and please keep them coming in the chat section. There's a couple of just very straightforward questions. What's the name of the organisation Monson is talking about now? I think we've put it in the description.
I couldn't hear the question. The name?
The name, yes.
Cargonomia. So cargonomia, it's coming from a cargo, like cargo bikes. So it's a type of bikes with which are designed in a way that you can transport, for example, vegetable boxes or furniture or instruments for a concert, or a lot of material for an event or whatsoever. And nomia, it totally directly refers to autonomia, which is a concept developed by the Greek-French philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis. And autonomia is about direct democracy as a cultural concept on how to rethink the society based on democracy, which means how to rethink our relationship with each other, with our institution, with our how do we take decision, and also how we can create cultural dynamics on self-implementation of our own limits and collective limits.
Very cool. I've got a question now from Sam Altman. If you're ready to go, Sam, just ask you to unmute. There
yeah, look, hello, Anitra and Vincent. Sorry, I can't say it the right way. Thank you for that introduction. It was very stimulating. My question really is, I guess, theoretical or also practical. What's the connection between degrowth, whether, you know, and it's very multiple meanings, and donut economics? Because my understanding of donut economics is it is about limits, you know, environmental limits as well as social needs. So is there any particular connection that you can talk about?
Do you want to speak to that, Basa?
Please go ahead, Anitra, because I've already spoken a lot.
It's quite interesting because Kate Raworth, who in a sense invented or coined donut economics, is online. If you do a search, you will find Degrowth and Kate, and she actually withdraws a kind of complete support for degrowth, because I think that she feels frightened that if you emphasize limits too much, it's not as attractive to people. That's the impression that I've gotten from a kind of debate that she's had with another degrowth advocate. So there's a lot of synergies in terms of, yes, she does actually recognize the limits, but she doesn't emphasize quite so much the reduction. Like we would emphasize that we really need to reduce as much as we can our consumption. Whereas she would sort of emphasize more, well, there's a lot of waste and that could be reused by other industries and that kind of thing. So it's a reframing of it. So there are a lot of parallels, but there's just some interesting distinctions as well. And it's more kind of from her side than from our side. Although degrowth is very explicitly like we are into degrowing.
I will add something on that. In our book, we go back to the history of degrowth as a semantic tool, as a provocative slogan. And it's quite interesting because it's a word which already existed in the 1970s in France in the debate, décroissance. And André Gorz used it. It was a name used for the translation into French of Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen work about the anthropology and the economic process and so on. But somehow it disappeared. And there was a guy coming from marketing business. He was a project manager in Publicis, one of the biggest French corporation of marketing advertisement. And in the late 1990s, he quit his job. He created the Adbuster movement. He was in Lyon and he's the founder of décroissance, degrowth, as it became as a movement and and this provocative slogan. And his main intuition was that we need, in a world dominated by advertisement, by marketing, either driven by politicians or corporation, and in a time when people start to realize that we face problems with limits, we face problems with the limits to growth, we face problems with environment, climate change, and so on. We need a type of world which cannot be co-opted by the system. And I'm afraid that donut economics will be co-opted by the system, as were a lot of former slogans. And so I would say that with Kate Westros, we would agree on most of the point, but she doesn't feel well with the word degrowth because she finds it too much provocative and not federative enough, or it's not like a sexy word where you can bring people on board. But the problem is that all the sexy words are already co-opted or taken by the advertisement. I mean, nowadays, if you look at the advertisement, you can buy everything in the name of the principles behind degrowth or donut economics. And somehow I would say that both are complementary. It's a bit maybe like a good cop, bad cop logic. So you need the type of slogan which would be more inclusive, which can bring on board more people. And you also need degrowth because it's really intellectually challenging. It pushes you to go further, to go really above type of misunderstanding or type of easy solution which will be implemented. And me, I feel myself, after 15 years being in the degrowth movement, I feel myself quite happy with degrowth, even if sometimes it's tiring because it also creates a lot of misunderstanding. But among all the slogans I could see appearing, being co-opting and disappearing in the last 20 years, degrowth is the only one which won't be so easy to be emptied from its content. And that is main force. So that's why you have to be pragmatic. And to be honest, when you speak about all the challenges and the complexity of problem we face and all the large diversity of approaches and debate we need to find a solution, one slogan, either degrowth or donut economics or transition or conviviality or frugal abundance, or we have a lot of slogans like that. There won't be any single slogan which will be enough. We need to understand that, yeah, we have to go above the slogans, and we have really to take time to go into a much more complex and wider discussion and debate. So I'm very happy that we have dialogue with Kate, and I'm very happy that there is a success around the donut economy. But I say, okay, be careful when I see that Amsterdam, for example, is applying a work to reform the city under the name of donut economy. And when I see what starts to emerge, I see already a lot of greenwashing appearing, even if it's full of goodwill and so on, where degrowth would be very helpful to go through as well into the debate, because it's always challenging us. And you have this semantic, which is counterintuitive for our people like us who've been manipulated and fed for decades and for generations with a religion of growth. And we need somehow to go above a lot of toxic concepts to liberate ourselves, to emancipate ourselves from the growth religion or growth culture, to be able to go into a much deeper debate and to find meaningful long-term solutions.
Thank you.
It's very cool. I like that phrase, frugal abundance. For Australians who are fans of our industrial history, the Harvester judgment, which said that a man, a male labourer, should be able to live in frugal comfort, was if I'm getting my history right, I'm pretty sure I am. So I like frugal abundance. That's a like you say, a good one to use. We've got a question now from Jack Ainsworth. If you're there, Jack, I think you don't have your video on. If you'd like to turn on, you can, or you can just speak to your question. Assuming that you're okay to unmute.
Oh yeah.
There we go.
Thank you.
Very good. Nice to see your face.
Nice to see you too. Thank you so much for your talk, Anitra and Vincent. It was fascinating. I'm an international relations student from the UK, and I'm really interested in degrowth. I think it's a powerful and uplifting vision. But for my kind of area of research, I'm really trying to think of the prospects for international relations in relation to degrowth visions. So I guess my question to you is, in a scenario where the main impetuses for conflicts, such as resource accumulation, endless economic growth and positional power, where those are taken away, I was wondering if you guys had an opinion about what this would mean for how we relate to each other across borders and across communities. I wonder if this is something you guys have thought about. Yeah, thanks.
As an international movement, degrowth gets together every couple of years with big conferences. Often there will be thousands of people there. And we have degrowth.info, which is a kind of hub, an online hub, where people from different parts of the world, you know, alert people to their activities and events and that kind of thing. In terms of, so there are definite, there are people with focuses on global south and global north kind of issues, but as a very grassroots and very interested in basic needs, kind of degrowth is very much a kind of conversation amongst a lot of different kinds of solidarity networks. There's this book that has just come out this year too, Degrowth in Movements, and that's really good for making kind of the connections that you're talking about in terms of altered globalization movement and different movements in different parts of the world. I suppose one thing that before I hand over to Vincent to have a go at this question is that a couple of years ago we had a kind of engagement between hundreds of degrowth advocates and the European Union Congress or Parliament. And that was actually really useful and very interesting, just kind of in terms of the sorts of questions that you're raising, because it was looking at very high level things as, you know, policies over carbon emissions, about food sovereignty and a whole range of kind of issues like that. And it definitely, while degrowth is a grassroots movement, there's a lot of thinking, and our 5th chapter in our book sort of really goes into a degrowth project, which looks like what would a degrowth world look like with different kinds of societies. I might hand that over to you, Vincent.
Yeah, I think degrowth is mostly built to continue what Anitra has just said. It's mostly built on a dialogue, and our geopolitical approach should be constructed on the same logic. And I will give you an example, which is maybe Syria, where everybody played a game which was where the real interests were always hidden, and everybody constructed a type of narrative about democracy, about Islamism, about imperialism, and so on, where behind everybody was interested in knowing how the gazoduct, or the gas, how do you say in English, the gas pipes crossing Syria. The key question was that does it go to the west, to Europe and the Western countries, or does it go to east and Russia, China, and so on? But in between, everybody played a lot of lie game, where one time we support these guys, the other time we support these guys, the other part is some of them in the name of democracy, the other in the name of anti-imperialism, and so on and so on. And the degrowth approach in such things is to work based on international dialogue and institution. I think United Nations could be a good starting point in reforming it, in kicking the special rights given to 5 countries, for example, including France, and to use this type of institution to say, okay, we are very happy with all your lies, but the key question is about gas. Nobody really cares about the Syrian people, about democracy, about whatsoever. And then we can start to have a much more adult discussion. Okay, we need more gas, we need to sustain our economies and so on. So stop lying, stop one time bombing this country, one time supporting the Kurd friends and the day after letting them bomb and so on. But be consequent and rational, and to behave like an adult, and to speak about the key challenges. And very often politicians and historically war were hidden by fake argumentation. We created type of hatred based on religion, based on nationalities, based on fears, and so on. Where behind the key question were really about resources, about land, and so on. And the degrowth approach, again, from a very bright, rational, realistic point of view, is to say, okay, let's stop with big lies and big emotional construction to manipulate the people, but be an adult and realize that we constructed ways of life when we need always more and more and more resources in a world where you have finite resources. So if we don't stop this race, we will go to more and more and more wars. So stop doing it, sit down, talk, and organize together a transition. And the good luck in that, if you take time to scrutinize what's happening in every country all around the world, you have exactly the same type of debate what we are having right now also in China, where inside the Communist Party in China, there are people saying that what they did in the last decades to follow this industrialization and this economic development, like the crazy, irrational, white people who are in hubris, was a mistake, and maybe China should go back to other values, much more based on rurality, on local organic farming, on low-tech technologies, and so on. So you have these debates happening in China. You have a debate happening in India, where we launched the book with our Indian friends, where in India you have strong movements. We won't say that they are degrowth, they will use other type of things, but they will say that they are for reappropriation of their self-determination against development. Development has a cultural, white, Western imperialistic tool, which is a post-colonial tool to keep on stealing the resources and exploiting the people. So you have this debate in India, you have this debate in Africa, you have this debate in South America, and so on. And degrowth tries to construct a network of people based on pluriversalism. So it's like we accept and assume and support and defend the idea of diversity and pluralism in cultures and history. And it's very needed, because an ecosystem without biodiversity is dying. You need biodiversity, you need diversity, and you need dialogue to learn from each other. And we also support the idea of inherited from this progressive or emancipatory approach of I forgot the name, universalism, which was a mistake, because in universalism you have this imperialistic approach, thinking that one way is only good, but we have a lot of things in common in respecting the diversity of everybody. And everywhere you have these questions, everywhere you have this fight, and we need to construct a pluriversal network of freedom fighters, of peace fighters, where degrowth is bringing a constructive narrative to understand what are the real challenge, and to avoid to be manipulated into a fake division, emotional argumentation, which are spread around by politicians and the mainstream media.
Thank you, both of you.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. Next question we've got, thanks for the question, Jack. Next question we've got is from Don Sutherland in Melbourne.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks to Anitra and Vincent for their very interesting presentations. My question is really about the sort of, if you like, the political economy of degrowth. It's pretty obvious in my view that the times do require a reversal in the demands placed on the environment by the capitalist economy, and also, of course, any economy that might follow it. It seems to me, though, that that must be done to a scale and a speed that at the same time tackles inequality, a crisis in democracy, a health crisis that is in some degree related to agricultural methods of agricultural production that capitalism now requires, and of course also a security crisis, the possibility of more regional warfare that will be bigger than it currently is. So my question in that context is, can capitalism permit or deliver such a process, whether you call it degrowth or reversing the demands placed on the environment?
Capitalism doesn't have any operating processes for remaining stable, let alone going backwards. So if we look at a degrowth future, we have to look at post-capitalism. So it's really, you know, the extent to which things that we have today can be carried forward and fit in with and support a degrowth future. And a degrowth future is all about everyone's basic needs being met. And it's also about caring for the earth as well as about caring for people. So in terms of economies, it's about relocalising economies so that people have really into producing for direct use, but in a collective sense rather than a singular household, as in self-sufficiency. And yeah, in terms of localizing economies, we're not looking at closed, isolated communities. We're looking at there being really strong networks. In degrowth, it's referred to as open relocalization. And this is especially important in a world where climate change is already meaning that there are vast migrations of people and everyone's dealing with refugees and migrants, and we're needing to have a high level of engagement with people from diverse cultures. And that's all part of degrowth, is to be very inviting and understand the real role and creativity that can be brought to communities when they're multicultural.
Yeah, in the book we developed a particular transition tool which is inspired by several things. I will only mention a few because time is running. The tool what we speak about is unconditional autonomy allowance. And it's a bit like an unconditional basic income, which means to give from birth to death to everybody what we consider democratically as enough to have a decent life, to have a good life. And on the contrary to the basic income, this unconditional autonomy allowance will be given as much as possible in a decommodified
I have
way.
to do it like this because otherwise.
Yeah.
Sorry, Vincent, go ahead.
Yeah, it will be given in a decommodified way, which means that the idea is to take the other direction to what happened since capitalism entered into our life, to commodify all the dimension of our life, from land to nowadays we try to commodify friendship. And the idea is to take exactly the other direction, to decommodify what we consider to be too much important to be let in the irrational hands of the market. And you could include in this unconditional autonomy allowance, you could include access to energy, to water, to food, to a place to have a decent life, to live. So also a place to have meaningful activities, which could be a land for agroecology, which could be a space for cultural activities, and also access to public services. In questioning what kind of public services, so we could include, for example, school, we could include health, some transport, and so on. But for all these type of things, it's a transition tool because it's an invitation for public deliberation, participatory debate about what are really our basic needs and how do we fulfill these basic needs. So these three main questions: what do we produce, how, for what kind of usage? And it's also connected with a maximum income, because I think there is no way to implement any minimums for all without maximums for all. So degrowth is really this idea to understand that there is no freedom without limits. And it's how do you organize democratically in respecting the environmental limits, in respecting how the ecosystem, how the resources which are serving our basic needs and so on, how do we deal with that in respecting the limits in a rhythm, in a way that we stop going into this blind system, which is providing a fake illusion of freedom, where you go to a supermarket, you think that you're free to buy everything, and you do that because you never face what are the real impact, environmental and social impact on what you buy. And you do it as well because you're manipulated to desire things what you don't really need. And through this unconditional autonomy allowance, we try to invent a participatory tool, providing all the minimum for all, but also providing a space for deliberation, for participatory democracy, to question what really matters, what's really important, and how to fulfill it.
And that's partly sort of meets the observation that capitalism has no operating systems for degrowth, for degrowing. The driving force is always forward in terms of growth. And in fact, if you work with an economy which is use values in kind, basic needs, then you can actually just be operating, and it goes back more into, I suppose, a rationing style of economy. But the point is, this makes sense in terms of the sustainability challenges that we face, and also our commitment to equity between people.
Thank you for those. The time is running really low, but I did want to ask two more questions, or have more questions asked, if that's okay, just with your permission, Anitra and Vincent. I know you're very busy, but I'll just flick to Bob Boughton, and if he could ask his question, then I'll ask the question to Michael Swift.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot. I'm glad you mentioned rationing, because my question's a bit linked with that. When I was in Cuba some years ago, they basically have to have a rationing system there in order to distribute their scarce resources. And but I'm interested in what links the degrowth movement has with movements in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in particular with the Cuban and Bolivian revolutions. And I'm wondering, does this social movement see it as a possibility that it might build alliances with state actors like the Cuban and Bolivian, well, not the current, but the previous Bolivian regime, who in some ways are sharing your goals for ecological sustainability?
Do we want to have the other question as well now, or?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, let's take both, and we can reflect on both together.
Okay, no worries. So the question from Michael Swift, who says he's spoken with you before, Vincent, is, I'd be interested to hear from one of the speakers discuss the solitary degrowth mitigation pathway prepared for the IPCC Working Group 3 from the 2018 report. And he's posted the link to that report. So it's I'll just post it again in the chat section so you can see.
Yeah, I can see it in the chat. I'm actually not familiar with it, but if Jason Hickel wrote it, Jason Hickel has done a preface to our book. So we are familiar with his work.
Very good. Okay. Sorry, Bob, if you wouldn't mind just muting yourself again.
So in terms, we have advocates and representatives of Global South and South American countries in degrowth. In fact, I was introduced to degrowth as an actual movement. I was aware of it in theory, but I was introduced to it when I attended a big conference that was in Montreal back in 2012. And in, I think it was 2018, there was also a conference in Mexico City that focused on degrowth in the Global South. So yes, Bob, those conversations and those networks are there. And in fact, those people have piles to share with us in terms of ideas and strategies and telling us what's worked and not worked in their experience.
I will have one more point. There is a fantastic work of Maristrela Swampa, who is an intellectual from Argentina, quite close to degrowth, and she also wrote a critiques of what was failing from a degrowth point of view in the Bolivarian revolution. So I think we have a lot of things in common. The discussions are going on and we can learn a lot from each other. And behind that, there is really the question of extractivism and anti-extractivism movement. If you look at what's happening now, it's a tragedy with this greenwashing around electric cars and electric mobility. It has a direct impact on the extractivism in countries like Chile, for example, with lithium mining and so on. And degrowth is quite close to all these resisting movement from indigenous movement, from local movement to fight against this extractivism, and also to learn from their maybe more spiritual approach, which are something maybe we should also question from a degrowth point of view in our Western so-called rational societies, which are very highly spiritual with a belief in the invisible hand of the market or this type of idiotism. But we can learn a lot from a type of spiritual wisdom or simply wisdom from a concept like Pachamama, like Buen Vivir, on how to reconnect ourselves to the nature and also how to construct type of cultures against any kind of exploitation, because the Western white male culture is about exploiting the women, exploiting all the people, and exploiting the environment, whereas there you can find type of cultures where it's about how to live in harmony with each other and our environment. So there are a lot of things going on and a lot of dialogue to implement. About rationing, I would like to say something. I think degrowth will be in favor of rationing, but again, based on the logic of autonomy, that it's what we do with my collective, for example, in Budapest. We don't start all to earn as much money as possible in developing always more projects to buy more things and so on, but we self-implement a type of rationing in understanding in an autonomous way what we really need. And there is this experience in France, which is the story of the Yellow Vest movement, which started against a type of rationing around the fake ecological or green tax implemented by Macron's government, which was actually a very weird strategy to turn a part of the society against the green and to push them to the fascists in order to reinforce the narrative that Macron is the last wall against fascism in France. And these people became Yellow Vest, were fighting against this ecological tax. And after very violent police repression, after a situation which was really frightening, we could implement, pushed by some degrowth friends and Yellow Vest people in France, what became the Citizen Convention for Ecological Transition. And what is quite funny, where 150 people were randomly chosen representing the French people and had the opportunity to reflect on what could be a meaningful, democratic, ecological transition. And they could sit every weekend for a year to debate on that and so on. And that's what they understood, that to be happy and to deal with limits what we face, we have to self-limitate ourselves. And and they decided themselves. So I am in favor of a type of rationing which is not imposed top-down, which would be a type of ecofascism, but which is based on emancipatory dynamics, starting from the people who get the right information and who can decide liberated from the manipulation of the mass media or advertisements, which are creating fake desires, and really to go to the direction of what we call frugal abundance. And because there is only one abundance, which is the one which is autonomous and frugally constructed, where on the other hand, we live in societies of overconsumption, which are frustrated. So we are not exactly in the country of frugal abundance. We are frustrated overconsumers because we create overconsumption through this narrative. And instead of speaking about rationing, I will definitely speak about democracy and to be liberated from all the manipulations of the dominant system.
Look, we've gone 5 minutes over, which I think we can probably go for another hour. It's very cool stuff, very interesting. You're a wonderful speaker, Vincent, and so are you, of course, Anitra. I think lots of our search members know that. So it's been just fantastic to have you on. Everyone can now chat with each other. I've just put up Vincent's Twitter and Anitra's Twitter. The comrades we've got on here are not ivory tower academics. I'm sure all of your questions, there we go, we've got Anitra's email there as well. You can contact both of these people quite freely and continue the conversation. And I think we've got a basis for further conversation as well. So I want to thank you both very, very much. The link to buy the book is the two books. It has been in the chat, but it's also on the Facebook event page. And of course, you get those emails there, or even they'll be on both Vincent and Anitra's Twitter handles, or if you need to find them, just email me and I'll send it to you personally. You can find me at search.org.au. This has been wonderful. I'm getting so many comments now. You can see them yourself in the chat there. I'll let Anitra finish first, and then Vincent, and then we'll actually play a song, during which time you can keep on chatting, or you can just hang up, and I'll tell you the song after we have our farewell from Anitra and then our farewell from Vincent. So you go first, Anitra, and then we'll hear from you, Vincent, and then I'll finish up.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone and say, yes, this is just the beginning of a longer conversation. We're up for talking about this as much as you like. And Vincent, over to you.
Yeah, and the book, what we did with Anitra, is really an invitation for debates. And I think degrowth is really meaningful where it puts more questions than answers, because the answers have to be co-constructed everywhere in a self-organized way and based on a dialogue, and also based on this fantastic journey of decolonization of our imaginary to be liberated from the gross religion or gross narrative and all the toxic concepts in our civilization around the consumerism, materialism, economicism, etc., etc. And then you can reappropriate a type of hope and enjoyment of life in constructing meaningful solution toward the very tough challenges that we face.
That's brilliant. Thank you very, very much for that. And the song I'm about to play, usually we've played reggae versions of Solidarity Forever. We've played lots of different